You're standing on a sun-scorched hill outside a coastal fortress, hands bound with rope that cuts into your wrists. And all around youths, kneeling in the sand. You were told this morning you were going home, that the ransom had been paid, that your city's surrender meant safety. But now you see the soldiers surrounding you, and they're not escorting you anywhere. They're drawing their swords. The air fills with screams, mothers clutching children, men reciting prayers they'll never finish. A mile away, on the opposite ridge, your own army watches helplessly. And the man who gave this order, the golden-haired king the whole world would call a hero, sits on his horse without expression, watching his soldiers work. Before we go any deeper into this nightmare, I have to ask, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me every single time that a story this dark from 8 centuries ago can reach people across every continent today. This is August 20th, 1191, the Third Crusade. The hill is called Ayadi, just outside the fortress city of Acre on the coast of what is now Israel. And the man who ordered this massacre, the systematic execution of nearly 3,000 surrendered unarmed prisoners, is the same man history remembers as one of its greatest heroes, Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart. For 800 years, his name has meant courage, valor, the perfect Christian knight. Children grew up with his legends, poets sang his glory. But what happened on that hill was so brutal, so calculated, so devoid of any trace of mercy, that even his greatest enemy Sultan Saladin, who had witnessed decades of medieval warfare, wept openly at the sight. This is the story they don't teach in schools, the day the hero became the monster. To understand how a king could order something this monstrous, you have to understand what kind of man Richard really was, because Richard wasn't born a hero. He was forged into something far more dangerous, brilliant mind weaponized by ambition, and an almost complete absence of empathy. Born in 1157, Richard was the third son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most formidable women. Third sons don't inherit thrones, they're backups, insurance policies. But Eleanor saw something in Richard that his father never did, a capacity for absolute ruthlessness disguised as martial brilliance. She gave him control of Aquitaine as a teenager, and Richard immediately showed what he was capable of. When local barons rebelled, he didn't just defeat them. He annihilated them so thoroughly that the violence became legendary across France. He stormed castles, executed prisoners publicly, burned entire villages. This wasn't about winning battles. This was about engineering fear so complete that no one would dare resist him again. By his early 20s, Richard had developed a reputation that terrified even his own brothers. He was physically imposing, over 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5. Contemporary chronicles describe him as powerfully built, with reddish gold hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. One Norman chronicler wrote that when Richard entered a room, men felt winter in their bones. But here's what makes Richard truly disturbing. He wasn't some mindless brute. He was brilliantly intelligent. Fluent in several languages, a gifted poet and musician. Tactically, he was perhaps the finest military mind of his generation. He could read battlefields like others read psalms. This was an educated, cultured, refined man who simply chose violence as his primary language. In 1189, Richard did something that shocked all of Christendom. He went to war against his own father. King Henry II was aging, weakening. Richard wanted the crown, and he wasn't willing to wait. He allied with his father's greatest enemy, King Philip II of France, and systematically dismantled Henry's power. They chased the old king from castle to castle, cutting off his supplies, isolating his loyalists. When Henry finally died, broken, defeated, some say cursing Richard with his final breath, Richard showed no remorse whatsoever. At the funeral, witnesses reported he stood over his father's body with a face like carved stone, then turned and walked away to claim his inheritance. Richard spent exactly 6 months in England during his entire 10-year reign. 6 months. Why? Because to Richard, England was nothing more than a massive treasury to be looted. He famously declared, "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer." He wasn't joking. He systematically stripped England of wealth-selling titles, lands, offices to anyone who could pay. He raised taxes to crushing levels. He emptied the royal coffers, all for one singular purpose: to fund his crusade. Because in 1187, something had happened that sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Saladin, the brilliant Kurdish-born Sultan of Egypt and Syria, done what many thought impossible. He had recaptured Jerusalem after 90 years of Crusader occupation. The holiest city in Christendom had fallen. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock upon hearing the news. Across Europe, the cry went up: reclaim Jerusalem, launch a new crusade, save the holy places. And Richard heard that call like destiny itself speaking his name. This was what he'd been training for his entire life. This was his path to immortality. The chance to become legend. But there was something growing in Richard that went beyond even normal medieval brutality. His own chaplain, a man named Roger, who traveled with him and wrote a biography, included something chilling in his private notes. Notes that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. My lord the king possessed a great gift for war, but it came with a terrible cost. He did not see his enemies as men. To him, they were obstacles to be removed, like trees to be felled or stones to be cleared from a path. And he removed them with the same emotion a farmer shows pulling weeds. This was the man sailing east to fight for Jerusalem. Not a noble knight from the songs, but a calculating, ruthless warrior who viewed human life as a commodity to be spent in pursuit of glory. And he was about to meet the one opponent who was his equal in every way except morality. To understand why the massacre shocked even hardened medieval warriors, you need to understand who witnessed it. Because standing in his camp across from that execution hill was a man who represented everything Richard pretended to be but wasn't. Sultan Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. Saladin's reputation in both Muslim and Christian sources is almost unprecedented. This was a man who fought crusaders for decades, who recaptured Jerusalem after 90 years, and yet was so renowned for his honor that even his enemies praised him. Christian chroniclers called him a prince among pagans and worthy of Christian baptism. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he could have massacred every Christian in the city. The Crusaders had slaughtered tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews when they first captured it in 1099. But Saladin offered terms instead. Those who could pay a ransom could leave safely. When he saw elderly Christian women weeping because they couldn't afford the ransom, he freed them anyway. When Christian wives begged for their imprisoned husbands, he released them. When orphans cried at the gates, he gave them money from his own treasury. Richard saw war as a tool for personal glory. Saladin saw it as a necessary evil to reclaim Muslim lands. Richard was willing to use any method to win. Saladin was constantly trying to maintain honor even in victory. They were military equals, but moral opposites. And now they were about to collide at the most brutal siege of the medieval era. The Siege of Acre is often called the most hellish military engagement of the Middle Ages. It began in August 1189, when Crusader forces laid siege to this vital port city. But Saladin immediately surrounded the Crusader army with his own forces. So the Crusaders were besieging Acre while simultaneously being besieged themselves. Grotesque stalemate where everyone was trapped and slowly dying. The conditions defy imagination. Disease swept through both camps like wildfire. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The smell of death hung over everything. Food ran out, then clean water. Men began dying of scurvy, teeth falling out, wounds refusing to heal, bodies literally rotting while they still lived. The Muslim garrison inside Acre was slowly starving, reduced to eating their horses, then leather, then rats. For nearly 2 years, this went on. Conservative estimates suggest 100,000 people died at Acre, more than the population of most medieval cities. Dead at one siege, ... Then in June 1191, everything changed. Ships appeared on the horizon, massive warcogs flying the royal banner of England. Richard the Lionheart had arrived. Richard hit Acre like a summer storm. He brought fresh troops, enormous siege engines, and chests of gold. Within days, he had reorganized the entire siege. His new trebuchets and catapults began systematic bombardment. Day and night, stones flew. Walls crumbled. Despite falling ill with fever, possibly scurvy or dysentery, Richard commanded from his sickbed, even having himself carried to the walls on a stretcher so he could personally shoot at defenders with his crossbow. By early July, the garrison inside Acre knew it was finished. They negotiated surrender. On July 12, 1191, after 23 months of hell, the siege finally ended. The terms seemed straightforward. Saladin would pay a massive ransom, around 200,000 gold dinars. He would release 1,500 to 2,000 Christian prisoners. And he would return the true cross, the relics supposedly from Christ's crucifixion. In exchange, Richard would spare the lives of the garrison, between 2,700 and 3,000 men, women, and children. They would become hostages until the terms were fulfilled. The deadline was set, August 20th, 6 weeks. From the beginning, the agreement was poisoned by mutual distrust. Saladin began gathering the ransom money, but collecting that much gold took time. Taxes had to be collected. Treasuries emptied across his territory. He started rounding up Christian prisoners scattered across different cities, but this required weeks. He sent emissaries with proof of progress, partial payments, lists of prisoners being gathered. But Richard kept finding reasons to reject these partial deliveries. The true cross first, Richard demanded. The gold and prisoners first, Saladin countered. Back and forth, each side demanding the other act first, neither willing to trust. The hostages, meanwhile, were kept in terrible conditions, packed into buildings within Acre, given minimal food and water, baking in summer heat. Richard grew increasingly agitated. He needed to move his army south toward Jerusalem. Every day spent at Acre was a day wasted. His soldiers were growing restless. Supply costs were mounting, and the hostages were consuming resources. August 20th came. The full terms had not been met. Saladin had delivered some gold, some prisoners, but not everything, not the true cross. The deadline passed, and Richard made a decision. August 20th, 1191, dawned hot and cloudless. Richard held council with his commanders. Some, according to later accounts, argued for patience. Saladin was clearly making efforts. More time might bring the full ransom. Others counseled partial execution, kill some hostages to show seriousness, keep others as leverage. But Richard had made up his mind. The prisoners were draining resources. They were a security risk. What if they rose up from within? But more than that, Richard wanted to send a message. He wanted every Muslim force between Acre and Jerusalem to know that Richard Plantagenet was not bound by the usual rules of war, that mercy was not in his vocabulary, that he was something to be feared, absolutely. So Richard gave the order. The prisoners would be executed. All of them. That morning, Crusader soldiers entered the compounds where the hostages were being held. "You're being moved," they told them. "Saladin has paid the ransom. You're going home." The prisoners were lined up, bound with ropes in long columns, men, women, children, elderly. Then they were marched out of Acre's gates toward a small hill about a mile from the city, a T called Ayadi, a hill clearly visible from Saladin's camp. When the Muslim army saw the column of prisoners being led toward the hill, something felt wrong. Saladin himself rode forward to watch. The prisoners reached the hill. Crusader soldiers surrounded them in a wide circle. The prisoners were forced to kneel in the sand. And then they understood this wasn't a prisoner transfer. This was an execution ground. The panic was indescribable. 3,000 bound prisoners knelt in the sand, watching Crusader soldiers draw their swords. Mothers clutched children. Men whispered final prayers. All screamed toward Saladin's camp for help they knew wouldn't come. Saladin understood instantly. Multiple sources say he tried to order a cavalry charge to save them, but his commanders physically stopped him. The Crusaders were ready, shields locked. Any rescue would be slaughtered before reaching the hill. One of history's greatest generals was forced to sit on his horse and watch as Richard ordered mass execution. Chroniclers on both sides recorded what followed. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, in Saladin's camp, saw it firsthand. This wasn't battle rage. It was organized killing. The prisoners were bound, kneeling, unable to fight or flee. When Richard's signal came, the Crusaders advanced and began the systematic slaughter. Baha ad-Din wrote, "The Franks flung themselves upon them and massacred them in cold blood. Our soldiers looked on and nearly went out of their minds with grief and rage. It lasted hours. Troops were rotated because the physical labor of killing grew exhausting. Only about 200 were spared for ransom or labor. The rest, men, women, children, elderly, were killed without exception." Saladin watched, weeping openly. Hardened warriors cried and screamed, some trying to break ranks and charge, held back only by force. The screaming from the hill was described as inhuman. Richard observed from a nearby rise, showing little emotion. One chronicler wrote, "His face looked like a man watching crops being harvested." By sunset, nearly 3,000 bodies lay across the hill. Saladin's response was immediate. Every Christian prisoner in his custody was executed. "I have stained my soul to answer Richard's crime," he later said. The massacre at Acre ended any hope of negotiation. The war turned brutal. Richard marched on, winning at Arsef and Jaffa, then executed entire surrendered garrisons when he claimed they broke terms. Yet for all his military brilliance, Richard never recaptured Jerusalem. He got close to Weiss's army camped within sight of the holy city's walls. But both times he turned back, deciding the city couldn't be held even if taken. Here's the bitter irony. If Richard had kept the agreement at Acre, if he had shown even tactical mercy and patience, he might have been able to negotiate a peaceful entry into Jerusalem. Saladin was pragmatic. He had already shown willingness to compromise. But after the massacre, no compromise was possible. Richard had burned that bridge himself with 3,000 lives. In September 1192, Richard finally negotiated a truce with Saladin. The Treaty of Jaffa gave the Crusaders a strip of coastline and guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem. It was reasonable. But it was far, far less than Richard had sailed east to achieve. He had come to reconquer Jerusalem. He left without it. Richard's journey home became almost as dramatic as his crusade. Attempting to take a shortcut through Central Europe, he was captured by Duke Leopold V of Austria. Richard had publicly humiliated during the siege of Acre. Richard spent more than a year imprisoned, held for the staggering ransom of 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times England's annual revenue. The irony is almost poetic. Richard, who had murdered 3,000 prisoners rather than wait for ransom, was now himself a prisoner waiting for ransom. England was bled dry to pay it. In 1199, 3 years after returning home, Richard the Lionheart besieged a small French castle over a trivial inheritance dispute. Fewer than 40 men defended it. A crossbow bolt struck Richard in the shoulder. The wound festered, and 12 days later he died in agony at 41. Legend says he pardoned the crossbowman, Bertrand de Gordon, and ordered him freed. His men ignored him and flayed Bertrand alive, the final proof that even Richard's rare mercy could not survive the violent world he built. 8 centuries later, Richard remains one of history's most celebrated kings. His statue stands outside Parliament. Films and novels cast him as the noble crusader, the righteous warrior, the heroic absent king of Robin Hood lore. But this is the cleaned-up version. The real Richard was brilliant and undeniably brave, but also responsible for one of medieval history's worst atrocities. Nearly 3,000 prisoners were slaughtered outside Acre unarmed, bound, surrendered under a promise of safety because Richard wanted to send a message that he valued efficiency over honor, victory over life, fear over mercy. Acre reminds us that many so-called heroes were far from heroic. Statues and stories often hide blood. Glory in war frequently means atrocity in practice. The line between hero and monster is often just which side writes the tale. Even Saladin saw something darker in Richard. Asked why Richard troubled him more than other crusaders, he replied, "Others are warriors." Richard is something Elsin's endless hunger for glory, no matter the cost in blood. History calls him the Lionheart. Perhaps the name fits better than intended. A predator's courage, a predator's lack of mercy. Today, the hill outside Acre is quiet, unmarked. Grass covers the ground where 3,000 trusting prisoners died. The screams are gone, but the silence remains, long with the memory of the king who ordered it.